The first words my sister spoke to me were not, "I'm sorry for your loss." They were not, "How are you holding up?" or "Is there anything I can do?" or even a simple, quiet, "I love you." No, the first words my sister Beverly spoke to me, less than 24 hours after my husband's military funeral, were delivered on my own front porch with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. "Half of everything you own belongs to my son." I blinked. The morning sun was warm against my face. Somewhere in the yard, a mockingbird was singing. The folded American flag from Walter's burial still sat on the entryway table just inside my front door, exactly where the honor guard representative had placed it with trembling hands the afternoon before. The world looked absolutely, perfectly ordinary. And yet nothing would ever be ordinary again. Beverly stood on my porch steps holding a thick stack of documents. Beside her stood my parents, my mother with her arms crossed tightly, my father staring at the floorboards beneath his feet. None of them had called ahead. None of them had knocked softly or brought food or asked how I'd survived the night. They simply appeared, like creditors. Beverly lifted the papers. "My son is your husband's biological child." She said it the way people announce the weather. Flat, certain, rehearsed. "I have documentation, DNA results, and I've already spoken to an attorney about his inheritance rights." My father's jaw tightened. He said nothing. My mother met my eyes for exactly 1 second, then looked away. That was when I understood. They already knew why she was here. They had come together. They had prepared together. The only person who hadn't been prepared was me, the woman who had buried her husband of 41 years the previous afternoon and spent the night alone in a house full of his absence. I looked at my sister, I looked at the papers, I looked at my parents. Then I smiled, a small, quiet, utterly genuine smile. "How interesting," I said. And I stepped back inside and closed the door. My name is Margaret Holloway. I'm 65 years old, and until the day before this story begins, I had been married to Lieutenant Colonel Walter Holloway for 41 years. We met in 1981 at a church social in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He was 30 years old, recently promoted, and almost comically serious about everything. He made lists. He arrived early to appointments. He replaced batteries before they died. I fell completely in love with him on our third conversation. Walter wasn't the kind of man who filled rooms with his personality. He wasn't loud or magnetic or prone to speeches. What he was steady. Profoundly, almost unfashionably steady. In 41 years of marriage, through 6 military relocations, 2 difficult pregnancies, 1 miscarriage, the deaths of 3 parents between us, and more separations than I care to count, he was the most consistent human being I have ever known. The funeral had drawn people I hadn't seen in decades. Former enlisted men, now gray-haired and wearing their old service caps. Young officers Walter had mentored who had since risen in rank. Church families, neighbors, veterans from the community who had never met my husband personally but who showed up anyway, because that is what that community does for its own. Over 300 people attended. Several drove more than 4 hours. Walter wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy by any conventional measure. But he had spent 30 years building something rarer than either of those things. He had built a reputation for absolute integrity. I remember standing at the graveside, listening to the bugle play taps, and thinking that I had spent my entire adult life beside this man and still somehow felt unworthy of the gift of him. By the time I returned home, casseroles had appeared on my counter. My neighbors had let themselves in with the spare key I'd given them years ago. People stopped by through the afternoon and into the evening. Friends from church sat with me until late. Eventually, the last car pulled out of my driveway and the house became quiet. I didn't sleep that night. Every room held a version of Walter I wasn't ready to release. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his coffee mug, the permanent indent in the left side of the couch, his handwriting on a grocery list still stuck to the refrigerator door. I made coffee before sunrise and sat at the kitchen table alone. Eventually, I decided to drive to the pharmacy, not because I needed anything in particular, but because I couldn't stand the silence pressing against all 4 walls. I was gone less than an hour. When I came back, Beverly's car was in my driveway. What happened on that porch set into motion a sequence of events I could not have predicted. But I also couldn't have predicted what I found when I walked away from Beverly and went to Walter's study. 3 months before his death, during a quiet evening when he seemed particularly thoughtful, Walter had said something I filed away without fully understanding. We were sitting on the back porch after dinner, watching the light change in the oak trees, and he turned to me with an expression I recognized as his important conversation face. "If anything strange happens after I'm gone," he said, "I need you to look in the bottom drawer of my desk, not the filing cabinet, the desk, the bottom drawer specifically." I had asked what he meant by strange. He smiled slightly. "You'll know." I had assumed he meant financial documents, maybe insurance paperwork he'd reorganized. Walter was meticulous about keeping our records current. I thanked him and promptly forgot about it, the way you do when you're not yet ready to accept that someone is genuinely preparing to leave you. Standing now in his study, Beverly's voice still audible through the closed front door, still talking about inheritance and legal rights and DNA, I suddenly remembered every word of that conversation. The desk drawer opened smoothly. Inside, arranged with the kind of precision that was so entirely Walter it made my throat ache, were folders labeled and organized by category: insurance, property, veterans benefits, banking. And beneath all of them, a sealed manila envelope, my name on the front in Walter's handwriting, below my name 4 words: "Open only when needed." I sat in his chair. Outside, Beverly had begun knocking again. I opened the envelope. The first document was a handwritten letter, dated nearly 2 years before Walter's death, not during his final illness, not in the months when we both knew time was becoming precious. 2 years before any of that, he had sat at this desk on an otherwise ordinary evening and written to me in anticipation of this exact moment. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, something has happened that required you to open this envelope. I hope it hasn't, but if it has, please know that everything inside was prepared with one purpose: to protect you." I had to put the letter down for a moment. Even dead, even absent, he was still trying to take care of me. That realization was both the most painful and the most tender thing I had experienced since learning he was gone. I continued reading. The letter was organized the way Walter organized everything: methodically, practically, without drama. Several pages covered the location of important documents, contacts for various accounts, information about his veterans' benefits, the name and number of our longtime accountant. He had summarized everything I might need and cross-referenced it with the folders in the drawer. Then I reached a paragraph that made me sit very still. "If Beverly ever approaches you regarding paternity, inheritance claims, or any assertion of financial rights connected to her son, do not argue with her. Do not negotiate. Do not sign anything without consulting Attorney Raymond Caldwell first. His contact information is in this envelope. Everything necessary to protect you has already been prepared." I read those sentences 4 times. Paternity, inheritance claims, Beverly. He had known, or at least he had considered it possible enough to prepare for, possible enough to consult an attorney and document everything. My husband had carried this concern, alone, quietly, without ever burdening me with it, for at least 2 years. I found Attorney Caldwell's business card tucked into the envelope. Beneath it was a folder marked confidential. Inside that folder was something I hadn't expected: the reports of a private investigator Walter had hired nearly 4 years ago. 4 years. He had been quietly gathering facts for 4 years without telling me. I felt a flash of hurt that lasted exactly long enough for me to recognize it and set it aside. Walter didn't keep secrets out of distrust. He kept them to protect the people he loved from unnecessary pain. 4 years ago, I would have been devastated to learn this was happening. He knew that, so he carried it himself. The investigators' reports were thorough. They documented a series of conversations Beverly had apparently initiated with Walter beginning about 5 years prior. At first, they were vague, suggestions, hints. Over time, they became direct. She claimed that her son Marcus, who was 18 at the time I was reading this, was Walter's biological child. Walter, according to the records, had denied it categorically. Beverly had not dropped the subject. The investigator had spent months verifying timelines, reviewing records, conducting interviews. The final summary included a sentence highlighted in yellow marker, which told me Walter had read this and considered it important. The paternity claim presented by the subject is inconsistent with available evidence across multiple independent verification methods. The claim appears unsupported. Unsupported, not inconclusive, unsupported. I kept reading, near the bottom of the foe. Elder were legal documents, updated estate records, revised trust paperwork, property protections, all signed, all notarized, all dated within the past 18 months. Walter had not simply investigated. He had then worked with an attorney to restructure everything, ensuring that no fraudulent claim could touch what we had built together. The document Beverly had waved at me on the porch, the version of Walter's she claimed to have found, whatever she had obtained was outdated by years. Either she knew that and was betting I didn't, or she genuinely didn't know. Either way, she was wrong about far more than she realized. When Beverly finally appeared in the doorway of the study, I was calm. Completely, genuinely calm. "Why are you hiding in here?" she demanded. "I'm reading." "You've been in here for 20 minutes. "I'm aware." She stepped further into the room. The study had always made her uncomfortable. Too many books, too much military memorabilia, too much evidence of a life built on discipline and purpose. "So, do you believe me?" I looked at her carefully. I had known Beverly my entire life. I knew the way her chin lifted slightly when she was bluffing. I knew the way she spoke faster when she was nervous. I knew that the confidence she projected right now was constructed, not felt. She had rehearsed this, but rehearsal isn't the same as certainty. "I haven't reached a conclusion yet," I said. Her jaw tightened. "The DNA results are right there." "I saw them." "Then you know Marcus deserves." "What he deserves," I said quietly, standing, "is a mother who told him the truth." I walked past her. The conversation was over. That evening, I called Attorney Caldwell. When his receptionist heard my name, her voice shifted immediately, becoming gentle in the way voices do when people have been waiting for a call they knew was coming. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, "Mr. Caldwell asked us to reach out immediately if you ever called. He'd like to meet with you as soon as possible." He'd asked them to expect my call. Not if I called, when. I met with Raymond Caldwell the following morning. He was a man in his late 60s, silver-haired and unhurried, the kind of attorney who looked as though he had spent decades listening carefully to complicated stories and then solving them quietly. He shook my hand and offered his condolences with what appeared to be genuine sadness. "Walter was a good man," he said. Yes, I agreed, he was. We sat down. He had already reviewed everything. Over the next hour, he walked me through what Walter had done, step by deliberate step. Several years ago, Beverly had come to Walter privately with her initial claim. He hadn't dismissed her outright. That wasn't his way. He had listened, then quietly begun verifying. When the facts didn't support her story, he hired professionals to document the inconsistencies. When the investigator's final report confirmed his position, he took the additional step of working with Caldwell to restructure our estate, creating legal protections that would hold up against any challenge. "He told me he hoped you'd never need any of this," Caldwell said. "Why didn't he tell me what was happening?" The attorney was quiet for a moment. "He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that you had already survived enough. He didn't want to damage your relationship with your family over something that might never materialize." I thought about that for a long time on the drive home. Walter had absorbed this burden entirely alone because he loved me enough to protect me from pain, even pain he himself was carrying. That was so completely, infuriatingly, heartbreakingly him that I had to pull the car to the side of the road for a few minutes because I couldn't see through the tears. Beverly didn't stop. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that my composure on the porch and my refusal to argue or negotiate would communicate to her what words couldn't, that she had miscalculated badly. Instead, she apparently interpreted my calm as weakness. The rumors began within days. I don't know exactly what she said or to whom, but the pattern became clear through the calls I started receiving. Distant relatives, old family friends, a woman from our church who prefaced the conversation with, "I just wanted to check on you," and then spent 12 minutes asking carefully worded questions that revealed she had already heard Beverly's version of events. Walter used to say that rumors travel like wildfire and truth travels on foot. I finally understood exactly what he meant. By the second week, people were whispering at the grocery store. Not loudly, not cruelly, but I could feel the sideways glances, the slightly too careful greetings, the pitying smiles that said I'm not sure what to believe but I heard something. Beverly was precise in her campaign. She wasn't reckless. She targeted people who were connected enough to spread the story but sympathetic enough to frame it generously in her fa. Vor. My parents, I learned, were telling people they were concerned about all parties involved, which was a careful, diplomatic way of not correcting their younger daughter's lies. One Sunday after church, a woman I had known for 20 years squeezed my arm and said, "You know we're here for you through all of this." The pity in her expression nearly undid me, because she clearly believed there was something to be through. She had already accepted that the story had substance. I went home and cried for an hour. Not because of Beverly, because Walter wasn't there. In 41 years, he had never once let me carry something like this alone. He would have known exactly what to say, exactly how to make me laugh about the absurdity of it, exactly how to remind me that we had survived far harder things than gossip. I would have made dinner while he sat on the counter and talked me through it, and by the time we ate, I would have felt better. Instead, I sat alone at the kitchen table in the quiet. The quiet was the hardest part of all of it. A few weeks later, Attorney Caldwell called. His voice was measured, professional. "Beverly has filed a formal legal challenge," he said. I closed my eyes. She's claiming inheritance rights for Marcus based on the paternity assertion. She wants a portion of the house and a share of the estate. Can she win? There was a brief pause. "No," he said, "but she can make the process unpleasant and she can drag it out if we let her. We won't let her." The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. During those 6 weeks, Beverly's attorney sent several letters attempting to initiate settlement conversations. Caldwell and I declined each one. Beverly, apparently interpreting this as fear, began telling people that I had refused to negotiate, as though that were evidence of guilt rather than of confidence. I spent those weeks doing ordinary things. I worked in the garden. I attended church. I had dinner with the couple next door. I reread Walter's letter so many times I had memorized most of it. One line in particular stayed with me. "Do not allow someone else's dishonesty to make you into someone you no longer recognize." I kept those words close, the way you carry something fragile through a crowded room. 3 weeks before the hearing, 4 men who had served with Walter arrived unexpectedly on a Saturday afternoon. Retired officers, all in their 60s, gray-haired and sun-weathered. They brought food and sat on the porch with me for 3 hours. At some point, one of them mentioned he'd heard things were complicated. I braced myself. He smiled. "Walter used to say the truth never needs to hurry, it knows where it's going." The others laughed. They all had stories about Walter saying things like that. We spent the rest of the afternoon laughing about him, telling stories, eating food, and I realized for the first time since the funeral that grief and joy could exist in the same afternoon. That I could miss him terribly and still feel grateful for the space he had left behind, filled now with people who loved him. Those men reminded me, not everyone had believed Beverly. Not everyone was waiting for me to collapse. Some people still remembered what character looked like after decades of watching it. The courthouse was a red brick building in the center of town, solid and unflashy, exactly the kind of place Walter would have approved of. I arrived 20 minutes early. He always said arriving late was a way of telling people their time mattered less than yours. Beverly arrived with her attorney. She walked as though the outcome were already decided. My parents followed behind her, and seeing them there, choosing, one more time, to stand on the wrong side of the truth, hurt in a way I hadn't expected. Age doesn't make betrayal easier. It just makes it more familiar. Beverly spotted me across the foyer. She smiled. Last chance to resolve this without a judge. I looked at her for a long moment. "No, thank you." Something flickered across her face. For just a second, before the confidence reassembled itself, she looked like my little sister. Like the girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. like someone who had made a terrible mistake and was only now beginning to understand how terrible. Then the moment passed. Caldwell arrived with a rolling case full of folders, greeted me quietly, and we entered the courtroom. Beverly's attorney spoke first. He was polished and sympathetic in his framing. He described Marcus as a young man who had been denied recognition by his biological father, who had grown up without paternal support, who deserved simply to be acknowledged. He presented the DNA results with the ceremony of someone producing irrefutable evidence. He spoke about fairness and inheritance rights and family. It was a compelling performance. Beverly took the stand. I will give her this. She had practiced. She spoke about hardship and single motherhood with genuine feeling. Some of it, I suspected, was real. Her life had been genuinely difficult in ways I had perhaps not always acknowledged. The courtroom listened carefully. I saw sympathy on several faces. Then Caldwell stood. He didn't rush. He didn't perform. He simply began asking questions, methodically, precisely, in the way that people who have prepared thoroughly always do. The DNA report Beverly had presented had problems. Significant ones. Chain of custody documentation was incomplete. The collection process hadn't been independently verified. The laboratory's certification for admissible legal proceedings was not current. Individually, any one of these gaps might have been explained. Together, they formed a pattern that was very difficult to dismiss. Then he introduced Walter's evidence. 4 years of documented investigation, certified records, professionally verified reports, properly authenticated legal documents, all dated, all signed, all legally admissible. Beverly's attorney objected repeatedly. The judge overruled repeatedly. The investigator Walter had hired testified calmly and precisely for nearly 40 minutes. He didn't editorialize. He presented facts, timelines, verification procedures, records reviews. The kind of testimony judges trust because it has no emotional investment in any particular outcome. I watched Beverly's face during that testimony. The confidence drained gradually, like water from a slow leak. First, the certainty disappeared, then the defiance, then the composure. By the time the investigator finished, she looked frightened, not nervous. Frightened the way people look when reality is arriving faster than they can manage. The worst moment of the day, for me, had nothing to do with evidence. It happened during a brief recess, when I looked across the gallery and found Marcus sitting in the back row. 18 years old. His mother's eyes. His entire posture radiating the exhausted confusion of someone who has been told a story for years and is only now, in this fluorescent lit room, beginning to question whether it was true. My heart broke for that boy, entirely and without reservation. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't created this situation, or benefited from it, or chosen it. He had simply been handed a story and told to believe it, the way children always trust the stories they're given by the people who are supposed to protect them. By late afternoon, the judge had heard enough. The challenge was dismissed, completely. No paternity claim, no inheritance rights, no legal basis for further action. The ruling was clear and it was final. Beverly sat motionless. Her attorney began gathering papers. My parents looked stunned, which suggested that Beverly had been at least as confident with them as she had been with me, and they had believed her. As people began filing out, I watched Marcus stand slowly from his seat. He looked at his mother. He looked at the floor. He looked at the exit. Then he walked toward it, quietly and steadily, without speaking. Beverly said his name. He didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He simply kept walking, and I understood exactly what that meant, because I had watched it happen to other families, other lies, other betrayals. The moment a child stops trusting the adult who is supposed to be their anchor is one of the loneliest moments in any human life. And no legal ruling had caused that. That damage had been done long before this courtroom. I stood outside in the afternoon light when it was over. No reporters, no dramatic crowd, a few cars in the lot, birds in the trees. The world turning at its ordinary pace, completely indifferent to the complicated human story that had just concluded inside that brick building. Caldwell shook my hand. "It's done," he said. I nodded. "Is it?" He understood what I meant. "Legally," he said carefully, "yes." In the months that followed, the silence in my house changed character. Before the hearing, the quiet had felt like holding your breath. After, it became something softer. Still grief. Still the persistent awareness of every space Walter used to occupy. But the fear had lifted. The thing I hadn't realized I was carrying, the possibility that our life together could be dismantled by a lie, was gone. And in its place was something I had been too distracted to access until now: gratitude. Gratitude for 41 years. Gratitude for a man who had spent those years not only building a life with me, but quietly, methodically, without any desire for credit, protecting that life from things I didn't even know were coming. The rumors faded as rumors always do, faster than they arrived, without apology. People who had been quietly sympathetic to Beverly's version of events became quietly absent from the conversation. Several people from church stopped me to say they were glad things had been resolved. None of them mentioned that they had believed otherwise. That's how communities manage these things. Quietly, collectively, everyone moves on. About 10 weeks after the hearing, my mother called. I answered more out of habit than willingness. We had not spoken since the courthouse. Linda, she used my old childhood nickname, the one she only ever used when she was frightened or sorry. Her voice sounded exhausted. We made a terrible mistake. I sat down. Beverly told us things, and we chose to believe her because she was our daughter, and we thought believing her meant loving her. We were wrong about what love required. She paused. We should have trusted you. There were things I wanted to say. Things I had been storing up for months, since the morning they stood on my porch looking away while their daughter threatened my home 24 hours after my husband's burial. But sitting in Walter's kitchen with his coffee mug on the counter and his handwriting on the grocery list, I heard his voice in my head so clearly it startled me. Accountability without cruelty, truth without revenge. I know, I said. Tell me how Beverly is doing. The answer to that question brought me to a modest apartment on the east side of town about 2 weeks later. Beverly had moved after the legal fees consumed most of what she had. The relationships she'd expected to sustain her through the aftermath had not materialized. People who enjoy drama rarely stay to help clean it up. She was working part-time. Marcus had put significant distance between them. She was, by every visible measure, starting over. I sat in my car, outside her building for a long time, before going to the door. When she opened it, she looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had recently set it down, not because they chose to, but because they couldn't carry it anymore. The confidence was completely gone. In its place was something I recognized as exhaustion, and beneath that, something I hadn't seen on Beverly's face in years: vulnerability. We sat across from each other in her sparse apartment. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she asked why I was there. I wanted to understand, I said. She laughed, but it was a sad sound. Understand what? That your sister is a terrible person. Understand what made you do it. The tears came slowly. Beverly had always been someone who performed emotion, dramatic crying, strategic sadness. These tears were different. These were the kind that happen when someone has finally run out of performance. She talked for a long time, about decades of comparison, about watching my life from the outside and measuring her own against it and always coming up short, about the marriage that had failed and the debt that had accumulated and the opportunities that hadn't arrived, while my life seemed, from where she stood, to require no particular effort to succeed. About how the resentment had built so quietly and so slowly that by the time she noticed it, she couldn't remember a time when it hadn't been there. The worst part, she said at one point, is that I told myself I was doing it for Marcus. I made myself believe he deserved answers, but Marcus didn't ask for answers. I wanted. She stopped. You wanted something to be his fault, I said quietly, so it could be easier to take. She flinched, then nodded. I kept telling myself I was owed something, she said, for all the things that hadn't gone my way, and your life was just there, right there, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. We sat quietly for a long time after that. There's something that happens when a person tells you the truth about themselves, an ugly truth, a shameful one, and you sit with it instead of using it against them. Something shifts. The distance between you becomes possible to cross. Before I left, I gave her 2 things. The first was the business card of a counselor I respected. A woman who worked with people, navigating exactly the kind of accumulated resentment and fractured relationships Beverly was dealing with. The second was an envelope. Inside was information about a scholarship fund I had established in Walter's name, intended for young adults in our community who were pursuing higher education. I had already arranged for Marcus to be considered for the first grant if he chose to apply. Beverly stared at the envelope for a long time. "Why?" she finally asked. I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because the best thing I can do with what Walter left me isn't to protect it from people. It's to use it the way he would have. And Walter would have found a way to help that boy, regardless of everything his mother had done. Healing doesn't announce itself. It arrives in small, ordinary moments that you almost don't notice until later, when you look back and see the accumulated evidence of it. My father showed up one Saturday with tools in the bed of his truck. He'd noticed a section of my back fence had rotted, he said. He thought he'd fix it. We spent the afternoon replacing posts, working mostly in silence, talking occasionally about the weather and the garden and completely unimportant things. When he was loading his tools to leave, he stopped. "I should have stood beside you," he said, "instead of behind her." "Yes," I said, "you should have." He nodded. That was enough. My mother sat at my kitchen table a few weeks after that and cried for 20 minutes and apologized in the way older people apologize, circuitously and imperfectly, reaching for the right words without quite landing on them. But the intention was clear, and intention is usually what matters most in apologies anyway. Marcus applied for the scholarship. He was awarded it. He enrolled in community college that fall, and by every account I received, was working harder than most of the other students in his program. Adversity, when it doesn't destroy people, has a way of clarifying what matters. I hoped it was doing that for him. He came to see me one afternoon in September. We sat on the front porch, the same porch where Beverly had stood with her papers, and I made iced tea and we talked for over an hour. He was thoughtful and quiet and carried a visible residue of embarrassment that I tried my best to address directly. "None of what happened was your fault," I told him. "I believed her," he said. "You were a child who trusted an adult. That's not a character flaw. That's exactly what children are supposed to do." He looked at me for a moment. "You're not angry at me." "Why would I be angry at you?" He didn't have an answer for that, but something in him seemed to relax slightly, which I took as progress. The following spring, our church organized an event honoring veterans from the local community. At the end of the ceremony, the minister announced the establishment of a new annual scholarship, the Walter Holloway Memorial Scholarship, for young adults in the region pursuing continued education. I stood at the podium to say a few words. Beverly was in the audience. My parents were there. Marcus sat in the third row, already enrolled in his second semester. Several of Walter's former colleagues occupied a row near the back. I had written and rewritten what I planned to say. In the end, I put the notes away and simply spoke. I talked about what Walter had left behind, not the house or the investments or the legal documents, though those had all served their purpose. I talked about the less visible inheritance, the patience I had learned from watching him navigate conflict without becoming defined by it, the preparation he had modeled as a form of love, the distinction he drew, consistently and without exception, between justice and revenge, the belief he held and never abandoned that the truth doesn't need help arriving. It just needs someone steady enough to wait for it. Afterward, I drove to the veterans' cemetery. The late afternoon sun was low and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory of itself. I walked to Walter's grave and stood there for a while without saying anything. The oak trees along the cemetery's edge moved quietly in the breeze. A mockingbird was singing somewhere, the same improbable song it had been singing on the morning my sister arrived on my porch with her papers and her certainty and her terrible miscalculation. I put down the flowers I'd brought. "You thought of everything," I said, "even the things I didn't know to worry about." The breeze moved through the trees. I've never been the kind of person who believes in signs. But that afternoon, in that light, with that bird singing, it was easy enough to imagine that the world was listening. If you take anything from this story, let it be the practical things first. Update your estate documents. Review your beneficiary designations. Talk to an attorney if you have assets worth protecting. Keep records of important conversations. Write down the things that matter before something forces someone else to figure them out. Walter did all of those things not because he was suspicious or fearful or cynical about human nature. He did them because he understood that preparation is a form of love, and that protecting the people you care about sometimes means doing uncomfortable work they'll never even know about. But take the other thing too, the less practical one. If you've been hurt by someone you trusted, a sibling, a parent, a friend, someone who should have stood beside you and instead stood against you, you are allowed to feel that. You are allowed to grieve it and be angry about it and take whatever time you need. Justice, when it comes, deserves to be witnessed. And then, when you're ready, consider this. The most durable response to betrayal isn't revenge. It isn't permanent distance. It isn't the satisfaction of watching someone suffer the consequences of what they did, though sometimes consequences are unavoidable and even necessary. The most durable response is to become, slowly and imperfectly, someone you're still proud of, someone the people who loved you best would still recognize. That was what Walter left me, not the house, not the trust documents, not the investigation files organized in military-precise folders. He left me a model of how to be human without losing yourself. I'm still learning from it, some days more than others. But I'm learning. And most mornings now, when I sit at the kitchen table with my coffee before the house has fully woken up, I feel something that takes me a moment to name. It isn't happiness exactly. Happiness feels too light for everything that's happened. But it's close. It's gratitude. Enormous, quiet, daily gratitude for a life built with someone worth building it with. That, in the end, is the only inheritance that actually matters. And it can't be contested in any court.